Welcome back. This episode explores a topic that is admittedly old, but it is hoped that this will help see something in better focus. Something that I fear will come up again in future. In the 90s, the term Asian values cropped up regularly in newspaper articles, as government officials made public statements justifying their way of doing things, by beckoning to a larger collective that we belong to, Asia, and an apparently unique and common set of values that we all shared. This is a term which has been bandied about considerably, in particular, by Dr. Mahathir and Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew's Asian values originate from the tradition known as Orientalism. Orientalism generally refers to the body of studies of Near, Middle, and Far Eastern societies and cultures, by Western scholars, originating in the 18th and 19th century. These earlier studies discussed the East solely in terms of how it related to the West, and consistently implied the superiority of Europeans, by painting Oriental culture as a negative inversion of Western culture. For example, Eastern men were described as weak and feminine, and yet, strangely threatening, Eastern women were described as exotic creatures, waiting for Western men to conquer them. It was through studies like this that European whites justified their racist beliefs. This in turn justified their colonization of the East and slavery. All very economically convenient for them. It was not until 1978 that Edward Said criticized the illegitimacy and dishonesty of Orientalist research in his book, Orientalism, but by the time, serious social and political consequences had already resulted. In the West, the 1960s was marked by much social activism. This coincided with a global economic recession, rising inflation, and high unemployment. This pressured the state to increase welfare spending, but this was not matched by public willingness to pay for it. As a result, increased welfare provisions by the state led to a higher and higher spending deficit, met only by borrowing from future generations. This, combined with social withdrawal and privatization of interests, gave rise to what the mass media called the Me generation of the next 2 decades, and paved the way for a conservative backlash, led by American President Ronald Reagan and the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Western conservatives bemoaned the fact that their society was going to the dogs because of excessive individualism. At the same time, their perceived decline of the West was accompanied by the meteoric rise of the newly industrialized economies, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and South Korea. Again, in the Orientalist stereotypical tradition of discussing the East and West as polar opposites, Western conservative scholars search for an answer, a magic Asian formula, to explain the success of these unease. Several explanations were arrived at. Firstly, they were accelerating so far ahead because of the infusion of foreign capital. Secondly, these countries, in a bid to eliminate communism, had only been too eager to adopt the capitalist mantra. The third explanation was that the culture of East Asian societies gave them a comparative advantage when attempting to modernize. It was the last explanation, as stereotypical as it was, that neoconservatives in the West were only too happy to embrace, especially since they had just complained about the decadence of their own culture, and were very eager to get their own conservative reforms underway. Using Asians as an excuse, they claimed that it was implausible to think that the Asian economic miracle could have taken place had these territories been inhabited by, say, Brazilians or Bengalis. This explanation belittled any differences between the cultures of the various communities, and even more importantly, ignored the fact that within countries alone, there would be subcultures that were very different from one another. Instead, that stressed that there was a perceivable quality that all the peoples of these countries shared, something that could be crystallized in one word: Confucianism. Lee Kuan Yew took to all the gross oversimplification involved, like a deprived bee that had just discovered a florist, for he was, if nothing else, the Asian counterpart to the Western conservatives, and saw the world through very similar eyes. In 1980, he expressed worries that workers here were becoming, in his words, too westernized and decultured. They were job hopping more, something that Lee equated with decreased organizational loyalty and greater indulgence of selfish personal ambitions. The next was that the number of singles buying HDB flats had jumped to an all-time high. That translated, for Lee, into increased potential for the emergence of a hedonistic singles lifestyle. The third was intense competition, at school and at work. and the final trend was conspicuous consumption amongst those who had made it. All these trends gelled together into a general social attitude of excessive individualism. In line with that, Singapore ministers began their attempts to collectivize the nation, as they promoted team spirit at every occasion possible. In 1981, moral education at the upper secondary level was implemented. Lee wanted Confucian values to be taught in school, but publicly admitted that Confucianism was something that Singaporeans weren't very good at. In 1982, he sent for 8 Confucian scholars from China to help him craft a conceptual foundation for a course on Confucian studies. What started out as discussions for a secondary school course became a mass campaign involving all the mass media, public opinion leaders, and Chinese voluntary organizations. Lee Kuan Yew himself put it thus in 1989: "Our task is to implant these traditional values into our children, so that these attitudes harden and are forged for a lifetime." The whole point can be encapsulated in the word implant. The traditional values of Confucianism are to be inserted as moral truths of all Singaporeans, young and old, so that they may be judged as essentially Confucianist, despite being culturally influenced by Western education. As a result, all of our actions can be judged by comparing them to the Confucian framework. As far as Confucian political theory is concerned, the most important elements in the pantheon of Confucian values are loyalty and obedience to authority. It is thus through the above-mentioned implantation exercise that voting for the opposition can be seen as disloyal, and opposition politicians can be labeled as traitors to the country, simply for being the voice of dissent. Lee then calmly kicked sand in Western faces, as he boasted of the cultural superiority of East Asians,